Today we're going to be talking about depression ratings and what are some things that you may not know. So Ursula, can you give us a general introduction on how one gets rated for depression?
So one of the important things to know about a depression rating is that whether the diagnosis is depression, anxiety, or PTSD, they're all rated under the same diagnostic code. So when we're talking about just depression, these ratings also apply to any other mental health disorder that you may be diagnosed with.
So one thing to know, a common misconception is veterans often think that you can be assigned any rating from 0 to 100, and that's not the case. The way that mental health ratings are broken up is you can either have a 0% rating, 10%, 30, 50, 70, or 100. And those are the only ratings that they're going to assign for a mental health condition. And so each of those ratings has its own criteria. And so it's going to depend on your symptoms and which criteria they correspond to.
Yeah, and typically those symptoms and the criteria has to do a lot with your occupational and social functioning. And so when you go in for a depression CMP, that's really what they're going to be using to rate you, is how much your mental health diagnosis, whether it be depression or anxiety, limits your ability to function occupationally. So in some cases, even when a mental health disorder has been diagnosed, like depression or anxiety, you can even get a 0% rating for depression. And typically a 0% rating would be assigned as if there is a diagnosis, but there's really no symptoms that are related to it. So a 0% rating can be assigned when a mental health condition has been formally diagnosed, but the symptoms aren't severe enough to interfere with any of your occupational functioning, and you also may not require medication for it. You have a diagnosis, yet it's really not affecting your life in any kind of way. But once you start having some symptoms, you could be eligible for a 10%. So a 10% evaluation for depression can be assigned when there are some mild symptoms that are kind of transient. The actual words that VA says is social impairment due to mild or transient symptoms, with a decrease in work efficiency. But for the most part, you can perform your occupational tasks without any major issues like remembering or anything like that. And as long as you kind of take care of yourself, you're still able to push through it.
So with 30%, you still have occasional decrease in work efficiency, but then you also have what they call the intermittent inability to perform occupational tasks. So what this means is you're going to have occasionally that inability to work and to do things. You'll have more trouble at work than you would with a 10%, but again, sometimes you're still able to function normally. So that's kind of the difference between a 10% and a 30%.
And just like that, as we kind of built on that 10%, the 30%, when you start getting up to the 50%, it's just a little bit worse than it was before. And with the 50%, it's more of reduced reliability and productivity. And that's on a pretty much very regular basis. So it's not intermittent. It's every time that you're showing up to work or doing things, you're having a hard time doing the same types of tasks. And some of the symptoms here do become much more severe than they were in the 10 and the 30% range. And some of those symptoms include changes in your speech pattern, panic attacks more than once a week, having a hard time understanding complex commands, so difficulty following directions. It's also having a lot of interpersonal problems with some of the people that you may work with and unable to really connect with those people when you are going into the workplace. And when you're in this range, you may see an impairment in your short-term memory with learning new things. However, you would still retain a lot of the tasks that you have known how to do for a very long time.
And then a 70% rating is where we start to see this is really affecting every area of your life. So we're talking occupational and social impairment. These are the specific areas that they list out. Work, school, family relations, judgment, or thinking. So basically it is impacting every area of your life. Some of the symptoms that correspond with a 70% rating are suicidal ideation. So keep in mind, it doesn't have to be that you have a plan or a suicide attempt, but even just the thoughts of, I wish I weren't here anymore, or I wish I would go to sleep and just not wake up, or everybody would be better off if I weren't here. That's suicidal ideation. That means you would be entitled to a 70% rating. Near continuous panic or depression. So specifically with depression, if you find yourself more often than not in a state of depression, constantly crying, unable to get out of bed, unable to participate in daily activities, that would qualify as near continuous depression. If you have speech that's intermittently illogical, obscure, or irrelevant, and intermittent means every now and then, it comes and goes. That doesn't have to be constant or all the time. But again, when you're talking and people are not always able to understand you, or your thought processes don't make sense, that is a criteria for a 70% rating. Impaired impulse control. So if you're not able to control your impulses, one of the common ways that we see this is with violence. Let's say that you get angry very often or very easily, and you then react physically, aggressively, violently. That would be a symptom of impaired impulse control. Spatial disorientation. So if you sometimes forget where you are or can't orient yourself. Neglect of personal appearance and hygiene. So if you're not showering every day, brushing your teeth every day, if you don't change your clothes every day, or let's say you do shower and then you put on the same dirty clothes. Those are all examples of you not maintaining minimal personal hygiene, and that would be a 70% rating. Difficulty in adapting to stressful circumstances. So this is something that's often reflected at work. Let's say that you have a job and you're able to keep a job, but you find that you're not able to keep up with the daily demands of your work, or something happens and you get completely thrown off and you're then not able to function because it's a stressful circumstance, and then everything is thrown off for you and you don't know how to react to that. Or if you have the inability to maintain friendships, relationships, you're not able to meet new people and make new friends at work, or in whatever setting that may be, that inability to establish relationships is going to correspond to a 70% rating. A 100% rating would be total occupational and social impairment, meaning you are completely impaired. So some of the symptoms that come with that are what they would call gross impairment in thought process or communication, persistent delusion or hallucination, persistent danger of hurting yourself or others, intermittent inability to perform daily activities. So if you have difficulty or you're not able to keep up with your hygiene, so let's say you don't shower every day, or you don't brush your teeth every day, or even maybe you do, but it's only because someone is telling you to or reminding you to. Those are things that the VA is going to look for when assigning a 100% rating. Are you able to carry on a conversation, or do you get lost in a conversation? Like you're not able to understand what people are telling you, or the things that you're saying don't really make sense to other people. That difficulty in thought process and communication, that would qualify for a 100% rating. Another symptom they look for is disorientation to time or place. So, for example, if you find yourself driving and you suddenly can't remember where you are or where you're going or how to get to where you're going, and it's a place that you've been to several times and you know and are familiar with, that would be an example of disorientation to place. And so that could be used for assigning a 100% rating. So keep in mind that with these ratings, you don't have to have every single symptom within that criteria to have a rating assigned, or to have that specific rating assigned. So you'll want to show that you meet as much criteria as possible. And what the VA is going to look for is which rating criteria most correctly or mostly corresponds with your symptoms. So where do you fall into? Now, the VA often is going to try and give you the lowest rating out of the symptoms that you list. You know, if on the CMP exam, the CMP examiner indicates that you have 5 symptoms, they're going to try to pick the lowest one. But what you want to do is point out the highest one and which symptoms you have that correspond to the highest rating possible. And so it's not a clear-cut if you have this, you're going to get this rating. You have to show as a whole that the symptoms correspond or warrant to that higher rating.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is important when we talk about the rating for mental health and especially depression is, day by day you may not know how bad your depression actually is and how withdrawn you're become or the issues that you're having with establishing relationships and really functioning occupationally or socially for that matter. And so before going in for the compensation and pension exam, make sure that you're kind of writing these things down and coming up with some examples. Ones that I see a lot of times is people stop going to do things like going to picnics or going to church, and they just prefer not to, or they used to do a lot of great things and have a whole lot of hobbies, and now they just really want to stay home and they don't want to talk to anyone. And sometimes that's because of the depression and the mental health, because they're unsure of how they're going to react being around people. And so if those are the types of things that you're doing by just isolating, staying home, make sure that you explain those things to the examiner, because just saying, oh, well, I stay home all the time doesn't necessarily encompass all of your mental health symptomology or show how bad it actually is. So it's always a good idea to kind of go down through the list of the symptoms and say, oh, I do that. When I go to work, I get so frustrated that I have to get up and go stand outside for 5 minutes so I can calm down. You may not think it's important, but it is important to get it in that examination so that it can be documented as one of the higher criteria for that rating.